In this video, I'm going to be discussing the importance of physique when it comes to attracting women and showing how the physique works in tandem with the face to determine someone's overall rating. Around 2022, we've seen a rise in the hype surrounding the female gaze, which seemed to go against the championing of aesthetically muscular physiques that we've seen in the previous decade. I believe a big part of this shift came as a result of physique desensitization and physique inflation. The 2010s were the decade when gym-selling popularity exploded, which was largely a result of the aesthetic subculture created by Ziz, who some might consider to be the first influencer, as well as the Gymcel influencers who followed him, such as Jeff Side, etc. Ziz's popularity in the Gymcel niche exploded in 2010, and he died in 2011 when his fame was growing exponentially. The Rugby World Cup took place in New Zealand in 2011, and as someone who grew up in a rugby-playing country, every NT guy was talking about the build of the rugby players and trying to bulk up in the gym and joking about guys getting on protein powder and creatine as if they were roids. A UK show called Geordie Shore also aired in 2011, and the main priorities of the males on the show were sleeping with girls and gym selling. At this time, wearing skin-tight t-shirts became the trend as men tried to erase women's advantage in club settings by sexualizing themselves off the back of their body, which women had been doing for years, if not decades beforehand. 2012 was when we seen the first wave of fake natties popping up on YouTube, and this would grow in the following years, with competition to be seen as having an aesthetic physique rising year on year. In the mid-2010s, you could still mentally keep track of all of the big Gymcel influencers, but by the end of the decade, in 2019, there were so many roid cells showing their physiques on Instagram that every girl has already been exposed to countless 10 out of 10 physiques online. So now it was no longer seen as a major advantage to show a Gymcel physique online, and displaying a natty physique online could sometimes be seen as a failo if you showed you were dedicated to a Gymcel lifestyle but looked mediocre by internet standards.
And this was when social media got big. This was when I signed up to Instagram, and I started posting pictures here and there when I was in the gym, and I actually started to get quite a bit of recognition for it because there weren't that many people on Instagram who were into their fitness, so I stood out more, certainly a lot more than I would do nowadays. Back then I was a big fish in a small sea. Now I'd like to say I'm a big fish, but the sea's fucking massive. Everyone is on Instagram now, so you don't stand out.
The topic of physique inflation has been spoken about a lot recently, with well-built physiques of today being considered mid by internet standards when they are miles ahead of what was considered a superhero physique in the mid-2000s. These were seen as jacked physiques in 2007. And in 2003, a full-blown roid cell physique was ridiculed for being too much and gorilla-like.
I think you've got great eyes, you've got great face, I'll give you a 9 there. Your body, I give a 5 because I think you're way too muscular. Like I said, it's too ape gorilla looking. I think it's just too much.
I'm still wondering why I was cut. Even the guys were saying, that I had the best body and stuff.
In the 2000s, since a top-tier physique was pretty much unheard of, the guys who had one could stand out massively, but for the majority of guys who had no Gymcel halo, they either had to hone their behavior to try get lucky, hence the rise of PUAs in this era, or they could rely on their face for success if they had face halo. In the 2010s, people realized that having a Gymcelled physique could give them an advantage over the competition, so more and more guys started to Gymcel and roid, which gave a massive advantage to guys with faces in the average range over non-Gymcelled guys with average faces. As the 2020s began, the Gymcel trend seemed to have passed its peak among normies, with many people not being able to work out due to gym closures, coming to the realization that their life isn't any worse after losing some strength and some muscle. The TikTok explosion among normies also began in 2020, and now girls who would have been socializing in person were spending hours per day looking at guys with mogger faces on TikTok. The standards for being deemed as having an attractive face seemed to shoot up overnight, and suddenly guys weren't considered to have an attractive overall package if they were mid-tier normie facially with a great physique, because the threshold to be seen as physically attractive in any way seemed to now require a high-tier normie face. While having a Gymcelled physique could set you apart from other MTN-faced guys in the 2010s, it now seemed to be redundant for slaying in the 2020s because the primary focus switched back to face with greater facial rarity being needed than before. The clothing trend switched from tight-fitting clothes that showed off your physique to baggy clothes which indicate that you aren't bothered, and your physique is irrelevant, thus drawing all attention to your face and your height, the aspects that are most difficult to alter. With us currently being halfway through the 2020s, it is interesting to speculate on whether Gymcel physiques will be seen as less relevant as we come towards the end of the decade, or if they will start to become more relevant again. You could say that the online gym selling niche is bigger now than it was in the past, with countless guys now posting their physiques to TikTok. But I think in terms of cultural influence, gym selling is less relevant in the lives of NT males and has fallen behind all-encompassing looks maxing. Funnily enough, there were PSL users predicting that this would happen over 5 years ago. And now, rather than seeing perpetual remakes of how to grow your chest tutorials, the trend is now how to get hunter eyes, how to get hollow cheeks, and how to fix your asymmetrical face fast. It is now a requirement to show your Gymcel physique in a non-blatant and more NT manner by showing your physique in just 1 or 2 Instagram pictures when you were shirtless at the beach on holidays, whereas a decade ago, posting a dozen shirtless gym mirror selfies in a row was considered acceptable. If you don't treat your physique as just a single facet of an appealing lifestyle and instead show it to be the entire focus of your life, it's seen as a failure in 2025. Just like how Gymcells from the peak era of the MISC section of the bodybuilding.com forum had giga standards for what constituted as an impressive physique due to constant exposure to top 0.1% physiques. People in the looks maxing scene now have giga standards for what constitutes as an impressive face, due to constant exposure to top 0.1% faces. This would go some way towards explaining why there are people in the looks maxing scene who say that muscle mass doesn't matter, for attracting women and adding muscle to your frame serves as no halo. If a man has a top 0.1% face and his body has a respectable level of leanness, then having a muscular physique is going to matter way less for him than it will for regular guys, because his face is already attractive enough for women to instantly have high interest in him upon seeing his face. I've often noticed that the biggest promoters of the female gaze maxed physiques use examples of pretty boys with extreme facial rarity to try to prove that the female gaze physique is the most optimal physique for all men. It should be obvious that what top facial rarity guys can get away with is not what's optimal for most men in the population. There just happens to be a correlation between guys with pretty boy faces and skinny lean physiques, because pretty boy faces get such good results by themselves that the marginal benefit from gaining more muscle mass doesn't feel like it's worth the effort to them. There is also the point to be made that pretty boys with skinny lean physiques would look even more mogger with muscular lean physiques, and it could even widen the range of girls they could slay without losing appeal to any age of girls. Androgenic Ogre aka Looks did an experiment that debunked the idea that JB aren't into muscular physiques. Some points to note are that pretty boys can get away with skinny lean physiques because it's congruent with their face and their archetype, whereas once your face reaches a level of aging and masculinity where you are competing against the most masculine moggers rather than being in your young cell bubble, a physique that doesn't reach a certain threshold of mass is now seen as a failure. When referring to guys who are in the average to above average range facially, having a Gymcel physique can have a massive impact in their overall appeal. There are of course plenty of variables, so I will discuss various circumstances and the level of importance of physique for each. If you take an average-faced, average-height 18-year-old, he's going to have very little to separate himself from the rest of his peers, so if he can attain a physique that's both lean and has a solid level of mass, he can really stand out by using avenues to run body game. If you're average height, you should gain muscle easier than a tall guy, meaning you can enjoy the perks quicker. And while it will take you longer to gain muscle than a manlet, you won't have to suffer the drawbacks of being a manlet. Ways of running body game are to show your physique online and also to spend time shirtless while on holidays and at dance music events or festivals. I know someone who's average in height and has a physique close to his natural limit. A girl once approached him in a nightclub and told him that she had seen him on the beach earlier that day and fancied him, and she spoke about how being shirtless haloed him because of his physique. If an average height guy has a natty limit physique, it can still be a halo for him in a t-shirt, But when he is wearing a jacket, it may not cause him to stand out relative to other average height guys wearing jackets who don't lift and are just relying on their natural frames to fill out their clothes. When I was in a uni gym, I noticed that most of the guys in the average height range only required a bit of natty muscle to fill out their frames, and these guys would often lift no more than 16 kilos on dumbbell shoulder press and 22 kilos on chest dumbbell press. Because of how little work is required for most average height guys to look filled out, it means that the halo of being gym-celled in day-to-day clothing isn't that extreme when you're average height. However, for tall cells, the difference between having a frame with no muscle mass and a frame with significant amounts of muscle can be night and day. At 6'4", I managed to gain 25 kilos of mass in adulthood while staying lean with visible abs after gaining the 25 kilos, and the difference in how people perceive me after my muscle gain has been dramatic. I started from a position where I had a narrow ectomorphic frame, so I went from being the skinniest guy in almost every room I entered to being the biggest guy in almost any room I entered. Being gym-celled at a tall height is truly an OP trait, and most tall cells aren't motivated to gym-cell, which allows tall gym-celled males to stand out even more. People will argue that being tall with a good frame makes gym-celling irrelevant, which is fine, but since so few people meet that description, it's barely worth considering. A lot of tall guys with lanky frames don't gym-cell, so they have the falo of not looking filled out, and as they age they tend to become skinny fat as they gain fat on their torso, but maintain their long, skinny limbs. Then you have tall guys with endomorphic structures, who are never going to lose weight and get in shape, so they also waste their height by looking like crap. When you compare a tall male with a tapered build to a tall male with a stocky or skinny fat non-tapered build, the tall male with the tapered build gives the illusion of being much taller, even if he's the same height as the stocky or skinny fat guy. When I finally passed the threshold of developing an athletic, muscular build, having started off skinny, everyone who met me after not seeing me in a while made the comment that I looked like I got taller. That's the power that having wide shoulders and a narrow waist and hips has for a tall male, since it's much rarer for tall males to have those tapered proportions than average height males or manlets. On the topic of manlets, many people will hate and say that gym-celling as a manlet is a waste of time. I believe it's context-dependent, the level to which a manlet should gym-cell, but I think it is a sign of lacking mental strength for a manlet who has a decent face to not have a fitness model-tier physique. The reason I say this is because the amount of strength and muscle mass required for a manlet to have a mogger physique is much less than what's required for a taller male to develop a mogger physique. I've touched on this point before, but a manlet with a good face and a fitness model physique can focus all attention towards those two traits on their dating app profiles, and they should do better relatively than they do in nightlife venues. Physique, girth, and face are the two traits that translate the most effectively through pictures, whereas height doesn't translate in the same way, because even if you have a pic where you are height-mogging a group of people, if you don't have a filled-out frame, its effectiveness is way less potent. The brutal thing about being 6'4" with the wrist girth of an average 5'10" male is just how out of the ordinary and lanky your bone structure will look in pictures next to 5'10" males if you aren't gym-celled enough to compensate for it. As for manlets who are 5'6" or below, gym-celling can hurt them and make them look too stocky if they take it as far as Jeff Nippard, and if you have a tiny frame as a manlet, gym-celling may not be enough to save you unless you can run aesthetics game. I once seen a manlet in a gym who decided to take off his shirt and his frame was tiny, but because his hips were even more tiny, he actually had a V taper and looked more tapered than me, despite me having an outrageous size advantage over him. The reason why I advocate for everyone to start gym-celling in their teens, and preferably be able to run shirtless physique game once they hit 18, is because it's incredibly fun and provides a confidence boost, particularly if you are not fully content with your face and you want women to approach and objectify you rather than being invisible and having to experience rejections and a feeling of having low value compared to your age-equivalent Foyd, who did nothing yet receive celebrity treatment. People may call it degenerate behavior to seek validation at festivals by being shirtless, but when you're a young cell who's never experienced female validation, the thoughts of getting it provides extreme motivation to improve your life, and improving your physique is the lowest hanging fruit which has the biggest bang for its buck, In terms of return on investment, assuming you're at least average in other physical metrics, I've only went to one festival when I was a young cell where I spent hours being shirtless, and the amount of attention I received after taking off my shirt was incomparable with having my shirt on. After taking my shirt off, I was being approached by girls every few minutes and was receiving treatment that made me feel as though I was entirely in the driver's seat in terms of the power dynamic. Since men are desensitized to seeing women in revealing clothing in public, they learn to control their impulses when they're in the vicinity of half-naked women and can learn to not let it affect their body language. Women, however, aren't desensitized to seeing shirtless men in public, since it's so rare. So in a crowd where 20% of men have their shirts off, the portion of those 20% of men with good physiques are going to trigger a primal reaction in women that they're not used to experiencing. I've witnessed it countless times, but many girls simply can't control themselves or stop themselves from making a remark towards a shirtless guy with an impressive physique at a festival because it's one of the only times where she's no longer the one with the upper hand in the power dynamic. In a club environment, the woman will always be wearing less clothes than the man, meaning she will be the one triggering more lust from the opposite gender. But when the man is the one who is wearing less clothes than the woman no longer feels like she has the upper hand, the same way as she does in the club, because she may be feeling more lust than the man is, while the man is typically just content to relax on the handful of days in the year where he can experience the liberation of being shirtless, whereas a woman can go out drinking half naked any weekend she wants. On the point of who benefits most from gym selling, I would say it's the men in looks purgatory. So upper mid-tier normies and high-tier normies, although there will still be a significant benefit for chadlights as well. At a dance music event where you are being compared to 5,000 other males in the venue, rather than the 300 you might be compared to in a club, having masculine and dominant appeal is mandatory if you don't want to get mogged by the biggest moggers in the venue. A skinny pretty boy chadlight can clean up in a nightclub, where he's at the highest level of looks rarity in the venue, but at a large stadium dance music event, he will get mogged by the low-trust-looking masculine chadlights with Gymcelled physiques that are scattered around the venue. Just observing the way women react to and flock to the Gymcelled and Roiding moggers should tell you all you need to know about who women see as the top dogs when there are countless males to choose from in environments full of strangers. They will feel most aroused by the men with the most dominant looks and aura. I think the idea that chads don't gymcel is just a black pillar cope, because they are too lazy to gymcel themselves, and they use fashion models as examples of guys who still look good and can slay while being skinny to prove anti-gymcel theory, even though the fashion models need to stay at a low weight as part of their job, and many have done some gym selling and would mog harder with some more mass. When it comes to regular chads who are cleaning up on Instagram and Tinder and monopolizing the supply of sex from females in entire cities, tell me how often these chads aren't gymcelled. Even the giga chad Tyler Maher didn't rest on his laurels and transformed himself from looking slightly narrow to having an ideal mogger physique. So many of the true chads who have the physicality needed to compete in sports are gymcelled on top of it. Even swimmers' physiques that are regarded as having the highest broad-range appeal, due to being tall with wide clavicles and small waists, these physiques have way more muscle mass than mediocre gym-selling normies, and it's not even close. So if you think you can compete on the open dating market against strangers while being non-gym-selled in 2025, you're sadly mistaken. That is, of course, unless you find some niche like skateboarding or a music niche where skinny twinks are acceptable, but the girls of these niches are still only a swipe away from being slayed by a gym-selled mogger. When you are in the most competitive bracket, i.e. looks purgatory, where every little possible advantage matters, you can't leave TLV on the table by not gym-selling. Fair enough, some guy who met his girl through social circle never had to gym-sell, but if you don't have that luxury, then you can't afford to be complacent. Also, the power that comes from slaying a girl who feels tiny in comparison to your gym-selled body is a mogger benefit, and having a strong lower body allows you to fuck better. If your face is average, you cannot afford to have a suboptimal body, and literally every guy on earth with a normie face would get better results with girls by having a mark-fit physique rather than a skinny-lean physique. When we swap the faces of guys with top-tier physiques versus normal or subpar physiques, we can see just how much impact it has on how you perceive someone's face, which shows that both the body and face work in tandem when it comes to how you perceive someone's overall rating, rather than them being assessed individually. Some might say that if your face is ugly, then having a Gymcelled physique just looks incongruent and makes you stand out more than a typical ugly guy who nobody would notice, meaning people focus more on the ugly guy with a Mogger physique and feel negatively towards him for being ugly and trying to compensate rather than just accepting his fate. So I can't say whether it's better to be an invisible, skinny, fat, ugly guy or a Gymcelled ugly guy, since I haven't heard enough anecdotes from people who transformed from one to the other. Although a caveat is that girls who would be willing to get with an ugly guy due to their own insecurity may reject an ugly guy with a Mogger physique, because it shows he has self-respect and makes her feel more insecure about her own body. When it comes to roid selling, I believe that roid selling can give you a positive return on investment in certain circumstances if you aren't particularly prone to side effects and you're a good responder to roids. Unless you're going the route of showing a relatable natty Gymcel progress journey online like Joe Phaser, then a Roidcell physique will likely be necessary to stand out as a Gymcel influencer just for your appearance alone. Of course, people can still make it in the Gymcel niche if they have their own gimmick or an appealing persona, but to gain traction based solely off appearance, a very polished and pristine look is required, which can often only be attained with roids. If you have a Roidcell physique, the instances of girls groping you and sexualizing you at festivals will be even more pronounced than if you're a natty Gymcel, but obviously there is a limit before you become too Roidcelled and look try-hard to the point where it seems as though you've been waiting your entire life for this moment, and people assume you have some mental issues you're compensating for. It's arguable that even if you turn away some girls by having a Roidcell physique, the ease with which you can slay girls who are into Roidcell physiques will be so much easier than the effort required to slay girls when you have a general appeal physique that having the Roidcell physique gives you a clear advantage simply in terms of slaying potential. If you have a general appeal physique, you're relying on your entire package, since your physique won't be the main determining factor on whether you pull a girl or not. Whereas if you have a Roidcell physique, you are in such little company that all you need to do is pass the face threshold for a girl who's into Roidcell physiques, and you should be able to pull her instantly. If you want to appeal to more normal girls, it's preferable to have a general appeal physique, however. Now let's answer the question of whether Gymcelling should be considered as cope or cheating your genetics, because you are developing a physique that you cannot sustain once you stop training, meaning it's not how your body naturally wants to look. I've used the term cheating genetics before to refer to men who manage to reproduce with an attractive woman out of their league while they themselves have a low-tier normie or subhuman appearance. I don't use the term cheating genetics when referring to people who have looks max to improve from their baseline appearance, because altering their appearance, despite their underlying genetics remaining the same, shows that they have the potential to mold their physical form into a superior version, which shows they are adaptable to the market, which indicates a solid sentience level. And it is also likely that their offspring will inherit this ability to adapt their looks to suit the market as well, even if they don't inherit genes that are on par with the looks-maxed version of their parent. If we imagine two people have identical frames, but person A weighs 70 kilos while person B weighs 80 kilos, and neither have lifted weights, but person B naturally holds 10 kilos of muscle more than person A. If person A gained 10 kilos of muscle from Gymcelling to end up with a near-identical physique to person B would, in theory, have better genes, but person A still ended up with the same outcome, whereby a girl who sees both of them for the first time can't differentiate between them. Assuming their faces are of the same level so they compete evenly for women, person A achieving equal results could be said to be unfair because he's less genetically fit naturally and he can't pass his trained muscle onto his offspring, while person B can pass his natural muscle onto his offspring. But person A has the trait of adaptability by being able to make up the deficit, so this trait can be passed on to his offspring to allow his offspring to compete just as well thanks to adaptability. Whereas person C, who has an identical starting frame to person A but never developed any muscle, can lose out in the mating game due to looking comparatively weaker and not being adaptable enough to make up the deficit. In a sense, this shows that trained muscle indicates genetic fitness, even if it can't be inherited by your offspring. But trained muscle still serves a function in a practical and immediate sense, since it's associated with greater fighting success, which can appeal to women who desire a male who's big for feeling protected. To answer the question of whether you can advocate for people to change their faces with surgery, while also being in favor of eugenics and remain logically consistent. In the case where the surgery is to fix a deformity such as an underbite, it depends on whether you believe that the underbite was part of someone's genetic blueprint, or they developed the deformity by falling short of their genetic blueprint. If you believe the latter to be the case, then getting a surgery to correct a deformity that came as a result of misfortunate development, rather than being an inevitability in your DNA, isn't necessarily cheating genetics. If the underbite is no more likely to be inherited by your offspring than it is to be inherited by someone with two parents without underbites, then I don't see surgery as going against the idea of eugenics in that example. If someone has their palate made narrow artificially by having their teeth extracted by a scamming ortho, then I believe that having surgery to re-widen the palate to the width it should have been is simply realigning with what nature intended. This takes me on to the debate that's happening now about how much of someone's development is dependent on genes versus early life nutrition. People might find it comforting to think that they had the genetic blueprint to have a well-developed face, but the only reason they fell short was because of the poor nutrition they received early in life. That way they get to cope that they have good genes, but were just screwed over by bad circumstances. Whereas accepting that they ended up exactly how nature intended them to look is to accept that they simply have bad genes, which makes them feel worse about their inherent value. I'm not firmly devoted to either camp, but I think that people need to stop blindly believing the YouTubers who claim to have grown multiple inches of height in their mid-20s thanks to changing their diet or following certain protocols which they wish to sell to you. The thing about claiming that height growth was due to certain protocols is that there's no way to prove that the height growth wouldn't have occurred regardless if the protocols had not been followed. My nutrition during my childhood and adolescence was suboptimal, yet I still reached a final height of 195 centimeters, which in hindsight was right in the predictable range based on my parents' height, although prior to the age of 16, I was always around average height among my peers, so I assumed my final height would be around 185 centimeters after a growth spurt. As a child, I would refuse to eat my lunch in school because I was a picky eater, so my day would start with a bowl of cereal, followed by a penguin bar during school, with some extremely overcooked meat and potatoes for dinner, and frozen food like waffles or sausage rolls for tea. If genetics didn't account almost entirely for height growth in a single generation, I don't see any way I should reach 195 centimeters relying on such a diet. I believe that it is the primary objective for your skeleton to grow in height and secondary objective for your skeleton to grow in width. Similarly, it is the primary objective for your skull to grow forward and secondary objective for your skull to grow in width. It is still possible to look aesthetic, even if the secondary objective isn't met. Tall guys with a lack of bone girth can still look good if they have a decent clavicle width, because it creates an elegant tapered look. I've noticed that some Zoomers have good forward growth, but an absence of skull width, which can still look good, because it creates the dog-maxed effect that exaggerates their forward growth, whereas some Zoomers have both forward growth and skull width, but their forward growth looks less exaggerated as a result. The dog-maxed look is more prevalent in the Phenos of Britain and Ireland, while having both forward growth and skull width is more common in northern mainland Europe. So if it is the objective of the skull to grow forward and in width, does it still have an objective to grow in height? I believe that it is the third objective of the skull to grow in height, but a minority of men have the growth pattern that allows them to develop tall skulls, which is an ascended trait on a mogger, when the rest of the facial development is good. I've coined the term TFBEM, which stands for tall-faced and bodied ectomorph/mesomorph, which is seen as the peak of masculinity because a tall face is the furthest away that a face can be from looking infantile, while the value of a tall body is self-explanatory. While ectomorphs are in demand for their tapered, elegant frame, and mesomorphs are in demand for their robustness and ability to remain lean. Endomorphs, on the other hand, are the least in demand by women because they tend to have non-tapered pear-shaped bodies and store way too much body fat to look attractive. Something I'd like to discuss is whether people are getting shorter and uglier, or if people are actually getting better looking. All evidence suggests that people have grown in height significantly when comparing the heights of the men born from 1900 to 1980, but height appears to have leveled off with men born in 2000 being no taller than men born in 1980. While better nutrition can account for some of the height growth, sexual selection can also account for the height growth, assuming more manlet genetics were weeded out, as women were more free to choose who they reproduced with. So why aren't heights continuing to increase if women now appear to be more obsessed with height than ever? This is because women vote with their wombs, not with their words. We seem to have reached an equilibrium where the women that are having children are happy with the height of the average male in their country, and they are not concerned with competing to try and secure a tall man to have a family with. Women's focus appears to have switched from selecting for height to selecting for face, as the bar for having girls consider you facially attractive as a male has been raised higher and higher in the space of just a decade. Based on anecdotal evidence, Zoomers in their prime were notably better looking than millennials in their prime, and we are only talking about a one-generation difference here. Part of it may be due to Zoomer haircuts masking phalos, which millennials didn't mask. But I believe women who had kids in the late 90s and early 2000s were more selective of the facial appearance of their partner than women who had kids in the 80s and early 90s. This coincides with the same time when males stopped getting taller, meaning focus has switched from height to face. Certain YouTubers say that humans only strayed from their natural diets of raw meat about 100 years ago, and claim that humans have gotten significantly uglier in that time. But I haven't seen any evidence that people are getting uglier. The evidence I've seen from 100 years ago suggests that people were uglier back then. Look at the English boys and girls in this video, and most of them would be called sub-4s by today's standards, with most of them looking like their faces are melting with bad maxillas. If you walk around an English town or city today, the average young person looks far better and more harmonious than that. Most young cells you'll see in an English city centre are going to be working class, so it is a direct comparison of the working class. And the working class are known for living on shit diets of pot noodles and takeaways, so the only way they could have gotten better looking, if their diets have supposedly been getting worse in the past 100 years, is thanks to sexual selection. A lot of people are likely to disagree with this, but despite middle-class teenagers being taller and having more mass than working-class teens, the working-class teens often have more harmonious faces on average and tend to have pretty boy or low trust appeal, while the middle class look more plain facially and are lacking in appeal. I put this down to women in the middle class selecting less attractive men due to them being financially secure, while women in the lower class don't have financially secure guys to choose from, so they're more likely to pick a guy with a good face. In densely populated areas where there are lots of guys to choose from, women will always be able to find another guy who mogs in terms of face, whereas when you live in a rural area or are part of a social class that less people belong to, face moggers won't be so easy to come by in a smaller pool of men, so women may be more likely to select for height. This explains why the urban lower class are around 3 inches shorter than those who are of a higher class or live rurally. I have never met a lower-class woman who has given a single fuck about height, and the fact that so many lower-class manlets get to reproduce shows height is irrelevant to lower-class women. With the world becoming smaller thanks to online dating, meaning there's always a better face mogger around the corner, women's primary focus in terms of sexual selection will continue to be face, whereas height increase from sexual selection in previous decades came as a result of people picking taller men because they were limited to a smaller pool of options and just chose a height mogger if they didn't have any face moggers in their pool of men. I want to address the idea that the average man was a Chad 60 years ago, that's based on a handful of viral yearbook photos or TikToks of people showing their parents or grandparents when they were young. This is the most obvious case of cherry-picking possible, and I would be willing to bet if you assessed the looks of the average student in a class, 60 years ago, they would be less attractive than today. When it comes to the argument that lifting weights causes stress to the body that ages you, and is therefore not worth doing, my response to this is that it is worth the trade-off to stress your body to some degree in your youth, if it means you can feel like a mogger with your shirt off while you are in your facial peak. I know people who have been gym-selling for 10 years who are still capable of age-larping over 5 years younger, so it's certainly far from guaranteed that the stress of lifting has any significant impact on aging your face in your 20s. Even if it does age you prematurely in your 30s, which can't be proven either way since you can't split yourself into two versions who work out and don't work out, this scene from The Simpsons summarizes my thoughts on the matter of sacrificing Gymcel physique halo for a potential marginal boost in longevity.
Did you or did you not use a senior citizen discount card at said car wash?
Well, I did.
Seems to me that a senior citizen has to be over 55. Isn't that so?
Well, yes.
And you are how old?
I suppose if you must know, I'm 60.
That's terrific.
Gosh, it's unbelievable. What's your secret, Flanders? I resist all the major urges.
All of them?
I haven't done any of those things, folks. You name it, I haven't done it.
Geez, Flanders, you're 60 years old and you haven't lived a day in your life.
Yeah, even the boy in the bubble had a deck of cards.
Yes, I remember that.